Hello, and welcome to another episode where I observe rich Deems where young Earth creationism gets the Bible wrong, and where I will be doing a critique of the biblical hermeneutics that are being presented here. So let's get back into the action then. We just talked about this idea that that 1,000 generations, when it is mentioned in the Old Testament in several verses, Rich Deem claims that this is referring to 1,000 generations in the past of the individuals that are being written to, while in fact I would say, based on the context, that it refers to 1,000 generations of descendants, not necessarily an exact 1,000 generations of descendants, but rather the implication that God's promises will last a very long time. And I do this because it is contrasted with the idea that the descendants of those who hate God will be punished to the third and fourth generation, and then contrast that to 1,000 generations of those who love him. And then in a different context, the contrast is saying that 1,000 generations of the promise of the covenant, and then it makes sure to display which covenant that is, and that is the covenant God made with Moses, Isaac, and Israel, for them to be his chosen people, which of course does not go retroactively but goes proactively to the future. So there you go. So that, just a little bit of a quick review of what we talked about last episode. So let's actually start up again.
Young Earth creationists say the creation days were ordinary days.
Okay, so this part is one part that I think is probably usually an opening argument that a lot of people make on both sides of the issue, because depending on what answer you come up with the meaning of the word yom in Genesis chapter 1 and 2, and the context, what the context indicates about it, depending on that meaning, you either have the day, as in a classic day, as in a night and a day-night cycle creation, or you have a day-age creation. Although I personally wouldn't use the term 24 hours because there's different ways to define hours. So by introducing a quantified amount of time, you're really leading to some confusion, because we know that the length of a day isn't something that is necessarily constant in our scientific observation, just like the length of a year changes from time to time. So just a little quick emphasis on that, because nowadays time is determined by the oscillations of the various isotopes, as opposed to the relationship between the Earth and the Sun in their relative position. And therefore, while one might say 24 hours if it were in relative position, but then you would have the problem of what about before the sun existed? And that's an interesting question. But let's actually get into what argument Rich Deem is going to make here before we start navel-gazing.
Does the Bible really say that the creation days were exactly 24 hours in length? Genesis 1, 9 through 13 is the account of the third creation day. Did all these events happen in exactly 24 hours?
Oh, I had a quick little loading issue, but everything's fine now. All right. So he's going to go over the third day of creation, and is, of course, going to question whether these events could take place in 24 hours. And again, my personal position is that putting a quantified amount of time on it is not exactly the best idea, because there's different ways to measure what an hour is, and so using hours, in my opinion, it will not give you a reliable metric to determining the length of a day. But I would say that when it says an evening and a morning, that does imply to me a day-night cycle, or more accurately, a night-day cycle, as it would be in the Hebrew reckoning. But let's go further.
So God created the continents on the third day.
Yes.
Next, God created the plants. How did he do this? The Hebrew word dashah means to sprout or shoot forth. So God, like any good farmer, planted seeds and let them sprout and grow. The Genesis text...
Well, we don't know whether he planted seeds. All we know is that the plants came forth. That doesn't necessarily mean that he planted seeds. I think that's an insertion that Rich Deem is making here.
Indicates that plants not only sprouted and grew, but grew to maturity and formed seeds. Clearly, this process took longer than 24 hours.
Well, does it have to, though?
It gets worse for young Earth creationists. The verb dashah refers not only to the plants, but also to the fruit trees that sprout, grow to maturity, and form fruit. This process typically takes at least several years. Young Earth creationists have a solution to the problem, saying that God speeded up the process.
And why is that not a solution? If you assume that an evening and a morning does indeed mean that there is a night-day cycle, and we know that if you assume that it is a night-day cycle and you assume a day-age proposition, that would mean that the night would be really, really long, which would mean the plants wouldn't survive. So if we assume all this, then I would say it would make sense that this would have to have happened in a short amount of time, a relatively short amount of time, equivalent to what one might call a day today, and that if these things really did happen in a day, then they surely must have happened rapidly. I don't see any problem with assuming that God can do that. I'm just saying that's, in my opinion, the best way to harmonize the idea that the verse implies evening and a morning, that it is a day-night cycle, and the idea that plants grew. If plants grew to maturity within one day-night cycle, then they must have grown rapidly. That's really the only idea I can say that implies to me, anyway.
However, the text of Genesis clearly says the earth brought forth vegetation, indicating a natural process. There is no suggestion anywhere in the Bible that God speeded up the process of plant growth on day 3.
Well, it is implied by the fact that it happened within one day. You actually have to go to the question of, does yom mean a day, and does the context of an evening and a morning imply a day? And if you say that it doesn't, then you get that it didn't happen in a day. Otherwise, you're really arguing from a different position, which is that you're saying that God couldn't have done these things within a day. And if you believe that God is indeed sovereign and all-powerful, then I don't see a problem of why God couldn't be able to do these things. So the real problem here is you have to either go with the idea that the days aren't actually days in the sense that the context actually does not imply that the word yom means day, which you don't go around doing by saying what's happening in that day, because we know that God is all-powerful, and therefore I don't think you're saying that God wouldn't be able to speed up the growing process. But I believe this is, in a sense, of course, the implication when he says the earth brought forth vegetation with emphasis on the earth. The implication I see is that he's saying that God spoke and then the earth brought forth on its own as a result of God speaking, as a result of God causing these things to grow, that then it started growing independently of God's action. I think that's the implication he's making. And the sub-implication then would be, because it grew independently of God's action, therefore, due to how fast it could grow independently of God's action, therefore, it would only grow at a certain rate. Therefore, in order for these events to actually happen, it would have to be longer than a typical day. But because we know that God specifically caused the growth in the first place, that God is the first cause of the growth, I can't really say that at any point in the verse, God's activeness in this event is in some way unhitched. So let's actually take a look at the verse. So let's look at Genesis 1. And we're on the NIV, all right? So let me just switch over. There we go. Okay. Okay. And God said, "Let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear." And it was so. God called the dry ground land, and gathered waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to the various kinds." And it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kind, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening, and there was morning, the third day. So one thing I would like to really unpack here is that what we see is that God is, in essence, creating by speaking here. So in verse 9, he speaks, "Let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear." And it was so. So he speaks, and because he speaks, his words, of course, hold power, and that causes something to happen. So in verse 9, we see a manipulation of the natural universe that is, of course, not naturalistic. In other words, this is a supernatural event happening here. Then in verse 11, he also speaks, talking about the vegetation, and then it says, "And it was so." So he's saying that the land should grow, that vegetation should grow out of the land, and that these fruit trees should grow out of the land. And it happened. So what we're not seeing is God actually planting any seeds. What we are seeing is God causing these to come into existence. And of course, even if we assume that God did indeed place seeds into the ground, or that he somehow generated seeds, we would ask, where do the seeds come from? Well, do they come ex nihilo, out of nothing, or is God using something else to make them? At which point do you break it down and you don't have a God anymore and you have a demiurge instead, where you have to say that God isn't actually doing something supernatural here. He's just has a large degree of control. But I would say that if God can move the waters and can shift the continents by speaking, I don't see why God could not cause plants to come into existence and then to grow to maturity by speaking. And at the end, verse 13, and there was evening and there was morning the third day, or the third yom. The third period of time consists of an evening and a morning, which of course implies a night-day cycle. And that, of course, for me, is where the assumption that this did indeed happen in a day, as we call a typical day that this happened in. Although the events within that typical day aren't indeed typical at all, since they are indeed supernatural events. But let's resume the video.
So at minimum, the third creation day lasted at least several years.
And again, that's only as if you assume that God ceases to continue his actions supernaturally as he did at the beginning of that day. Or that if you assume that there is an ongoing process that is not rapid. So what you really have to assume is that, unlike I, who believes that since it does say an evening and a morning, this action is limited to within that time span, what you're doing is you're saying that the determination of a time span is limited by the action, which I think we're coming at it from opposite directions. And we may reach an impasse, but let's see where we continue here.
Creation Day 6 is another day that would have required a long amount of time to accomplish. Contrary to the claims of skeptics, Genesis 2 is not a different version of the creation count, but a more detailed account of how God created human beings on the sixth day. Young Earth creationists say the sixth day is exactly 24 hours in length. But let's see what really happened.
And again, most Young Earth creationists that have seriously studied the science of how long days are wouldn't say that the day would be 24 hours in length. I know that 24 hours is a common buzzword a lot of people have, so I guess you are right, Rich Deem. I do not believe that saying 24 hours is entirely accurate, as it gives a it gives an unusual and an inaccurate accuracy to the statement. An imprecise accuracy, I believe, is maybe a better term, if you contrast the ideas of accuracy and precision. But let's continue.
That day. First, God created the animals. Then God created Adam.
And again, what's interesting here is that he's shifting between Genesis 1 and 2 on this. And one reason I think is because if we look at Genesis 2, let me just shift over here. Genesis 2, if we look at it, what we actually see is, in contrast to Genesis 1, it actually talks about the animals after man, where it says, so the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden. in verse 15. So man's already exists there. Then in 19, now the Lord God had formed out of the ground all the wild animals and all the birds of the sky, and he brought. Okay, so what we see is that the animals that we see in Genesis 2 are, of course, the account is in a different order. And what that implies to me is not that the Genesis 1 account is incorrect or that these are two different accounts of two separate events. What it implies to me is that the perspective of the event has shifted. And how do we know the perspective has shifted? Well, we see a difference in how God is referred to, Yahweh and Elohim. There's a difference in how the word that is used for God is used. For example, in the NIV, it capitalizes Lord with all four letters capitalized, and that's a very common English rendition of the Tetragrammaton. That's Yahweh, or some people say Jehovah, although I would say that maybe that's not the most exact vocalization of the word, because in ancient Hebrew it's written in vowels, not vowels, it's written in consonants, so you have to insert the vowels. But then we look up at Genesis 2, 1 and 2, which in my opinion probably should be part of chapter 1, but I'm not the one that made the chapter divisions. It's some guy several, maybe even millennia after it was written. The chapter and verse divisions aren't really part of the original text, is what I'm saying. So we see God here, that's actually saying Elohim. Now, some people, some liberal scholars, use this to say that this is actually a separate creation narrative, that man was created in chapter 1, and then Adam was then created separately from other men in chapter 2, or that sometimes they might even say man was created twice in chapter 1, but I disagree. So what I see, the way I interpret this is that Genesis chapter 1 through Genesis 2:2, Genesis 2:3, goes through an account of creation in general, well then from Genesis 2:4 onwards we see a more detailed and specific account to the actual humans that lived in that creation. So what we see is two different perspectives. It's sort of like looking at the Gospels, where there's different perspectives on the same events. But what I would point out, though, is that since the chapter division of Genesis is a later edition, it's actually a narrative that goes from Genesis 2 all the way through Genesis 3 before we really see any major cut in the narrative. So the narrative goes from the creation of Adam and Eve and what they were in the garden and their original innocent state, and then through to the fall of man, which obviously happened on a different day than the creation of man, because God did indeed say his creation was good at the end of the sixth day, and then he rested. So if you're going to say that Genesis 2 is a retelling of the sixth day, or it is a full-on retelling of the sixth day, then you would also have to ask the question, where does the narrative of the sixth day stop? Because the narrative, as it is in the raw text, continues all the way through chapter 3. So what we see is that Genesis chapter 2 and 3 do not have the 7-day perspective that Genesis chapter 1 does, which means that the events of Genesis chapter 2 do not necessarily all occur on the same day, even though many of them we do know did indeed occur on the same day. But let's actually get back into the video here. So let me just shift that over.
And planted a garden in Eden. What does the Hebrew text mean when it says God planted a garden? The word meaning to plant comes from the Hebrew natah, which can refer to physical planting or can be used metaphorically, usually referring to the establishment of a people group at a specific geographical location. If we look through the Bible, we find 55 verses using the Hebrew word natah. Here's the table of the first 13 instances in the Old Testament. Most of the verses refer to the planting of seeds to grow crops. A few refer to the metaphorical usage. So in all instances where crops or trees are mentioned, the word refers to the planting of seeds. So
yeah, and nobody's going to debate that that the Garden of Eden was planted. Nobody's going to debate that.
From the uses of the Hebrew word natah, we conclude that God planted the Garden of Eden from seeds and let it grow.
Well, we don't know if he let it grow or whether he grew it out. Because we know that if we do assume that the previous instance of plant growth in Genesis was rapid, then we have no reason to assume that the instance of plant growth later on in Genesis also is not rapid if God himself is still in the creative process.
After planting the garden, God put Adam into the garden and instructed him what to eat and not to eat. Then God instructed Adam to cultivate and keep it. The Hebrew word to cultivate is abad, which means to labor or do work. The exact same word is used in Adam's cultivation work outside the garden after the fall in Genesis 3:23. The Hebrew word translated to keep is shamar, which means to guard or protect. Since there were no other humans at the time, one assumes that the other part of Adam's job was to keep the animals from destroying the garden. After Adam had been put to work cultivating the garden, God brought all the cattle, the birds of the sky, and every beast of the field to Adam to name. This list would be expected to include all birds, over 10,000 species, in addition to mammals, 5,000 species, amphibians, 6,000 species, and reptiles, 8,000 species. Since young Earth creationists believe the entire record of nature, including extinct species, were present when Adam was created, this would include at least 10 to 100 times the number of species, at least 300,000. Even if we include only genera, the kinds, instead of species, Adam would have to name at least one genus per second for 12 hours straight. Following this, God put Adam...
All right, so this is, I think, pretty interesting. Because this is assuming a limitation based upon taxonomy. And it also assumes that Adam would have a similar taxonomical idea as modern taxonomists have, which is, in generally speaking, probably not the case. So we don't know what the taxonomical criteria Adam would have when taxonomically dividing the animals into various kinds of animals. And so this is an interesting question, I would say, because there are instances where there are different genera that are interbreedable, and there are different species that aren't interbreedable, and it may not even be a question of genera, because remember, the taxonomical system that is used to classify all these animals is a construct that was made by scientists to organize information. And what we are assuming here is that Adam would have reason to somehow divide this information in a similar way as scientists today divide information. And one example, I would say, that shows that taxonomical implications are different throughout history is when you look at fish and whales, all right? Traditionally, well, not traditionally, but in many cultures, the word fish was used to refer to all aquatic animals, regardless of whether or not they were mammalian. However, nowadays, if you were to call a mammalian aquatic animal a fish, people would say that that is incorrect. And that is because of the different standards of taxonomy and how they have now become general knowledge. And as such, we, just like ancient peoples did not taxonomically divide animals in the same way people do today, I don't see a reason why Adam would have the same divisions as people today have either. So what I'm saying here is that even assuming genera may indeed overcomplicate things, as the most obvious classification, if you're just looking at an animal, might be by some general feature that the animal has, such as an ungulate. And there you go, I've already classified many species and many genera by just saying the word ungulate. And so that's one example. So what I'm saying here is we don't know Adam's classes for animals, and we shouldn't assume to know that he would divide things in a similar way that people would divide things today. So assuming that it might take 12 hours may be perhaps a bit long. But of course, another question arises in, of course, Adam himself was created without any genetic defects and was probably, naturally speaking, significantly smarter than most people are today. So I wouldn't say that he would have any problems naming animals rapidly, but we don't know because we weren't there. So I think this is just pure conjecture, just like I am conjecturing in a different direction. What I'm saying is, if we look at the context of how it describes the yom, it's an evening and a morning, and that implies to me a night and day cycle.
Asleep, took a piece from his side and formed Eve. Upon waking, Adam exclaimed, "Now at length." The Hebrew word pamah has been variously translated at last, finally, and now at last.
And of course, we do have to remember that Adam wasn't very old. So this event was, in essence, something that happened after his whole lifespan up until that point. And Adam had never met anyone that was old, and therefore he had no real perspective when it comes to age. So we don't know if it could be something. For example, you're waiting for some food. You go to a restaurant and they serve you food. At last, here's my meal. And you maybe only waited 30 minutes or something. So what I'm saying is that this does not necessarily mean that a very long time transpired.
Showing that Adam had waited a long time for Eve's appearance. The answers in Genesis' response to the problem of fitting all the activities of day 6 are reproduced here. Of course, they get some of the events wrong because they were wearing their young Earth glasses. AIG says God creates the garden. However, the Bible says God plants the garden.
And again, isn't planting the garden the same thing as creating it? And if we assume that God is planting a garden, and that there's now animals in the garden, and that Adam is expected to live off the garden, wouldn't we expect that there would be some vegetation? Otherwise, Adam would starve. Just imagine this. You're planting food, but you don't actually have any food stored up. So you have to wait for your crops to become ripe before you can actually eat anything. And what happens then? You starve because you don't have anything to eat. So I would say that logic would imply that for a garden to be properly considered to be planted, and for God to properly instruct Adam about the various trees that are around him, the garden would need to have a certain degree of growth. Otherwise, the passage wouldn't make sense.
There's a big difference, since planting involves putting seeds in the ground and letting them grow.
And again, it's not a question of letting them grow. It's whether or not the garden is planted. We're never told that God then waited for the plants to grow, that Adam had to wait for the plants to grow. Just like in the third day, we're never told that God had waited for the plants to grow, that he had taken his hands off the wheel. We're never told that.
They say it only took an hour to grow. Seems unlikely.
And again, answers in Genesis, they are doing these timelines. They're making these timelines. I don't necessarily agree with this timeline. And again, we have to remember that they're only operating with 12 hours here, when in fact they should be operating with the time span that begins from dusk to dusk, because it says the evening and the morning were the 6th day. So we've got about twice the amount of time that's on here for all these events to transpire. So here we go.
It took only 4 hours to name the tens of thousands of genera.
And again, there's no implication in the Bible anywhere that these are the taxonomical distinctions that Adam would have had to make.
AIG says God told Adam and Eve what they should and shouldn't eat. However, in Genesis 1, God's first command was to be fruitful and multiply. Then he told them to eat plants. However, only Adam was told not to eat of the forbidden fruit, before Eve was even created. Noticeably missing from the list was a lunch break for Adam. According to AIG, God forced Adam to work 6 hours straight without a break.
Is that really hard, working 6 hours straight without a break? I mean, I've worked 6 hours straight without a break, so is that really an objection?
However, if these events actually occurred over a period of days to years, Adam would have needed to know what not to eat during that time. Hence, the Bible says God told Adam immediately after he was put into the garden what not to eat.
Yes, and I do believe that Answers in Genesis is getting this timeline wrong, in the sense that it was Adam himself that God told what not to eat and what to eat. And of course, Adam, as being in charge of the garden because God had put him in charge, is therefore responsible for what happens. So let me just go to... Okay. Yeah, I'm just going to quote here. I'm not going to switch over. Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, over all the creatures that move along the ground. So Adam was in charge of the creation that God had made and that God had put him in. Adam was supposed to be in charge and responsible for it. So that is also one of the reasons why Adam's sin did not only affect himself, but everything related to him, everything that was under his power.
I felt the need to add another line to their table, since Adam complained about getting lonely. So I sort of squeezed it in between 2:59 and 3 p.m., right before Adam's operation. So it's pretty clear that AI...
And again, another thing, we don't know if it took an entire hour for God to create Eve. We don't know that if it took an entire hour for God to create Adam. These are arbitrary times that Answers in Genesis has put, and they don't actually have any justification for any of these time spans.
G's timeline is completely unrealistic. Day 7 is technically not a creation day.
I personally... Now, this makes me different from a lot of other young earth creationists. I believe that the seventh day is important for the completion of creation, even though nothing supernatural is actually occurring on the seventh day. For me, it is important as part of creation. But I think we're actually going to get into some interesting issues here. So I'm going to stop at this point and start again later. Thank you all for watching, and I will be seeing you all next time on Awiltos Over and Out.